am Laurie Baranovan. I'm a professor at the law school and also the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. If any of you are here for CLE credits, is anyone here for that? Okay. You are too. You get double because you're presenting. So there's one credit for today's lecture, and there's an attendance roster in the back of the room by the door. So you're all set? Okay, great. And there are also Hot Topics brochures in the back of the room if you guys are interested in seeing what other lectures we have coming up. There's some great ones this summer. There will be a short Q&A following the lecture for around 15 minutes, depending on how long our speakers go. And then we try to end right at 1 just to be sensitive to our students that have classes from 1 to 4. So we are really pleased to welcome Dr. Heather Rowley and Delcianna Winters from the PETA Foundation. To give you a little bit of background about both of our speakers, Dr. Rowley is the supervising veterinarian for captive animal law enforcement at the PETA Foundation. In that position, she leads investigative and enforcement actions in cases of abuse of animals in roadside zoos, circuses, and other captive animal exhibits in the U.S. Dr. Rowley is a graduate of the University of California at Santa Barbara with a BS in Biological Sciences and received her DVM, Doctor in Veterinary Medicine, degree from Western University College of Veterinary Medicine, where she focused on wildlife medicine and forensic pathology. Delcianna J. Winters is PETA's Vice President and Deputy General Counsel for Captive Animal Law Enforcement. She recently completed 2 years as the first academic fellow of the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program, and her primary interests are in animal law and administrative law. Her work has appeared in the NYU Law Review, the Animal Law Review, and she has pieces forthcoming in the Ohio State Law Journal and the Florida State Law Review. So a very busy and prolific author. So welcome to you both. I'm going to hand this over to...
A little microphone here. Is that working for everyone?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon now. So I'm going to kick off the conversation today just with a bit of background, and then I'll pass it off to Delcianna, who will talk about a bit of the more specifics, particularly relating to the work that we do with elephants here in the United States. But I think it's important because we are talking about wild animals. Please remember and know that an elephant in the wild and an elephant in a captive situation are fundamentally genetically the same. Elephants are not domesticated, and of course what we do with elephants in captivity has implications for wild elephants and vice versa. So let's just first talk about who elephants are. They are, of course, Earth's largest terrestrial mammal. With that comes along a lot of anatomical and physiological traits that make them very unique. There are 3 species. There's the African savanna elephant, the African forest elephant, a little bit lesser known, and the Asian elephant. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that breaks down in a minute. They are herbivorous. Is that microphone sounding okay, or is it too high? Okay. Sounds a little bit strange from here, but they're herbivorous mammals. They spend a good portion of their day invested in just that activity alone of eating and finding food. Very meaningful activity for an elephant. They're incredibly long-lived. These animals in the wild can live up to or upwards above 70 years old. They're highly migratory, all 3 species. And to varying degrees, of course, because that depends upon their habitat, depends upon where they live, but all 3 species do migrate over relatively vast distances. They're incredible animals socially. They are matriarchal in society, and for those of you who were here before when I spoke about orca, that's another example of a matriarchal society, fairly uncommon in the animal kingdom. But what that means is that the matriarch, the females are in charge in elephant society. And the matriarchs in particular, the older females, these are one of the few mammals on the planet that us among them have a very long post-reproductive period. It's similar but very different, actually, in elephants to our postmenopausal period. And that is associated with cultures where the females are valued for their knowledge, for their contributions to their society and their family ongoing. These matriarchs literally run the show. They have all the cultural knowledge that they convey down to their family. They live in herds of related females and their immediate offspring. And the offspring females typically stay with their natal herds, and the males leave around those sort of teenage years. But of course, there's a long maternal investment in these babies. They're very intimately connected emotionally. Those bonds are very, very strong. And they're also reliant on their mothers for a very long time, into their teens, in fact. And that is not just nursing, although they will nurse for a pretty extended period of time, even when mom has another baby. Sometimes those older babies will still be nursing. They're also just psychologically still developing through that period. So long maternal investment, including during pregnancy. These animals actually carry their young for almost 2 years in their bellies before they're born as well. So big, big, big maternal investment. So the societies are, like I said, matriarchal, but they're also highly complex beyond that. And these animals, they communicate. They live within a network that's much bigger than just their little herd. It's actually a fusion society, which is also common in dolphin society, if you know anything about dolphins, where there is a lot of interaction between herds and coming and going of individuals. And they, of course, in order to maintain that as large migratory species over large distances, they really needed to develop amazing and sophisticated communication skills. And this is one of my favorite things about elephants that we're just still learning a lot about. And you would think that elephants have great hearing because, of course, they have these very big ears. So naturally, you'd think that their ears are actually, primarily, they play a role in thermoregulation. That's why you see elephants flapping their ears a lot. It's not that they don't have good acoustic hearing. They can hear, and of course, they do make a variety of sounds that we hear, squeaks, whistles, trumpets, but they also primarily communicate through infrasonic sound. So we actually can't hear the low frequency rumbles that they produce, high intensity, but low frequency. And they do that because low frequency waves travel much, much further in the environment. So they can actually communicate around 60 square miles, I believe it is, of distance with just through these infrasonic sounds. And they modulate what time of day, because temperature plays a role in that. And so they modulate what time of day they're more active vocally, and so that those sounds can travel further. They also communicate, not just through the air, but seismically. So they actually produce those rumbles, and they also use stomping and other things into the earth, and those can transmit up to 20 miles. And so they can actually receive these. They have a couple adaptations of their skeleton that make them very sturdy, because of course they're very big. And also they need a lot of cushioning in their feet, because you can imagine how hard it is to carry around 10,000 pounds all the time. So they have these big fat pads that support their skeleton right at the bottom of their feet. And of course fat is also a great conductor of sound, so we believe that they're also feeling the earth and feeling these rumbles through their feet, and also through their trunks, which are incredibly, incredibly sensitive. And of course, we can't talk about elephants without talking about trunks. And this is the difference between, this is an Asian elephant, this is an African elephant, so they have an extra little thing. When you get to know elephants, there's a lot of differences that it's very easy to tell them apart. Between Asian and, this is an Asian down here. They have much smaller ears. Africans have bigger ears. And these guys are much smaller than Africans, generally speaking. But the trunks can weigh 300 pounds. They can hold 12 liters of water. It is probably the most amazing organ that has ever evolved. Actually, it's a fusion of the upper lip and elongation of the nose. It has no bones in it, so highly, highly flexible and highly sensitive and easy to maneuver. And these animals actually have about, I think it's an incredible number. It's like up to 100,000 individual muscle bundles in these trunks. So incredibly sensitive, and also incredible to maneuver. And they can pick up little teeny BB pellets. It's incredible what they can do. Of course, they're intelligent as well. We've now determined this after having them in captive environments. We've studied that not only do they use tools, not only do they have incredible memory, an elephant never forgets is a saying for a reason, not only are they incredibly socially attached and socially aware, They also have self-awareness, and that's one of the few characteristics, at least as we define self-awareness, that few animals on the planet share, including a few whales and dolphins, human beings, of course, and some non-human primates, specifically great apes. Tusks, of course, we're going to talk a bit more about, unfortunately. There is an elephant crisis on the planet, happening on the planet today. There are, as I said, three species, three groups of elephants. There's the African savanna elephant, and when I say species, of course, that means they're genetically distinct. They don't interbreed. The African savanna elephant gets a lot of attention from a conservation standpoint. That makes sense because, of course, there is a massive slaughter. The rate at which these animals are being slaughtered for poaching primarily, of course, is shocking. And the population as a whole is absolutely not sustainable. However, if you look at the numbers, of course, African savanna elephants are more numerous than the other two elephants, and a lot of people don't realize that, primarily because African elephants get so much attention around the poaching issue. Forest elephants, although forest elephants and Asian elephants both can, as you can see, this is a big tusker male, they also have tusks, but they're much smaller. They're not as commonly targeted because you can't get as much ivory out of these guys. However, that obviously doesn't mean that they aren't threatened with a number of other things, as you can tell from their population estimates. The African forest elephant is threatened with a number of things, not just poaching for ivory, but poaching for meat. Habitat destruction, primarily extractive industries in Africa. That's logging, that's oil, minerals. So a lot of of course, when you go into these habitats, like I said, these animals are highly migratory. They need vast expanses of habitat in order to thrive as a population. When you start breaking that up with roads and other things, you're going to fragment that area. And not only that, you're going to introduce people into spaces where these animals traditionally were undisturbed. And of course, that creates conflict and opportunities for poaching. So extractive industries are incredibly problematic also for the poaching issue. And that is largely the same for the Asian elephant. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the Asian elephant just in a minute. But human-elephant conflict is a huge problem across the whole range where these animals are found. Poaching for ivory, meat, and even leather for their skin is also problematic for these guys. There are at least 3 subspecies of Asian elephant. I want to highlight this because this is, from a conservation standpoint, incredibly important. This Asian mainland population, this is the spread over which Asian elephants are, this whole area. In numerous countries, the Asian mainland elephant is, by the numbers, by far the biggest, the most representative of that population. Sri Lankan is significantly smaller, but also much bigger than the Sumatran population. So, of course, Sri Lanka and Sumatra are both islands, so these are genetically isolated as well as physically isolated elephants. Special mention to the Sumatran elephant, not only because this is the little-known, most endangered elephant in the world, on the planet, but because I have a particular passion for this landscape in which they're found and have had the pleasure of doing a lot of work there. They are genetically distinct, and in fact, the most genetically distinct. So even from a management standpoint in captivity with these animals, it is not recommended that any crossbreeding be encouraged in that setting because this is such a genetically distinct subspecies. Once a widespread population, now this population truly is highly fragmented. We do not know how many of these animals exist. Of course, they're the smallest of the elephants. They also live in forested areas. It's a lot harder to find and track them, and therefore also to keep them safe and keep them out of human conflict situations, but also because of what is happening on the ground to their landscape right now. Primarily, this guy is this whole ecosystem, which includes the only place on the planet where endangered rhinos, tigers, elephants, and orangutans all live together under one canopy. This incredible landscape in northern Sumatra where these animals live is being threatened right now by conflict palm oil primarily. So the palm oil industry, I'm sure a number of you being very environmentally conscious are aware of the devastating impacts that palm oil agricultural practices have had. Of course, palm oil is not the evil thing here. It is, of course, the way we use palm oil. And it is a form of slash and burn agriculture that's employed They literally just incinerate the forest and then monoculture is planted, so it just destroys everything. That, of course, is a very delicious plant for an elephant, especially an elephant who might be starving because their habitat's fragmented because they can't move around properly. And of course, that creates a draw and a lot of conflict, and these guys end up primarily, poaching is a big issue, but primarily poisoning, trapping, snaring, and otherwise killing them. So can't consider, I'm happy, we don't have time today right now, but I'm happy to talk more about with any of you about the palm oil issue. Of course, we play a direct role in that. I just want to mention, like, maybe not right here in Vermont, but most superstores that you walk into in the US, 50% of prepackaged snack foods contain palm oil, and there's no traceability, and it's a very difficult issue. But we need to get that industry under control because all of the world's tropical forests are threatened by those practices. And of course, we play a role there. I do want to say also that there is really good work being done on the ground, so it's not all doom and gloom. It is an incredible landscape, and it's also a landscape of hope because there's still enough of it there, and there are local leaders on the ground who formed a consortium, the local NGOs, which is sort of a cooperative network amongst, that I think is pretty unique amongst the conservation community globally. I've really never seen people cooperate the way that they are on the ground, and as a result of that, they are suing palm oil companies for millions and millions of dollars, and they are winning, and they are restoring forest. But we need to continue putting pressure on the companies who are on the traders in particular, who are sourcing conflict palm oil and putting it into our snack food. The poaching crisis. Of course, everyone's largely very familiar with this. Horrible, horrible devastation. Of course, in 2014, this awful statistic came out that said within the former 3 years alone, that 100,000 elephants had been poached and killed. And didn't seem like this was slowing down after that until actually fairly recently. Of course, this is fueled by demand on the one hand, but it's also fueled by poverty, incredible poverty, because although it is organized criminal syndicates that are typically behind this trade, oftentimes on the ground, the people physically, and this is true in every landscape where there's poaching, the people physically doing the poaching are often desperately poor local people who have opportunistic opportunities to take these animals and make some money. So poverty plays, of course, a huge role in that. Political and civil unrest, which of course breeds more organized crime, and weapons availability, and then of course demand. The cool thing that is happening with ivory right now, and it's a bit encouraging, and of course I'm sure you all are aware that the US under the Obama administration closed some of those domestic ivory trade loopholes that we had here that kept this a big market for demand for ivory. And China has actually just done that last year as well. And what the loophole is primarily that there is sort of it's very difficult to age ivory, right? So there is a legal trade in ivory that is, of course, antique ivory bought and carved before a certain date, not believed to be impacting elephants in the wild currently. And then, of course, there is blood ivory that's being brought in illegally, and those are getting mixed. When you have a domestic legal trade of ivory, it's very hard to control. So they've just made the domestic trade of ivory in China illegal, and we have actually seen dramatic impacts from that in terms of, it's early on, it just happened last year, but in terms of at least perceived imports, the actual number of imports that they are picking up, despite what we're told is the same level of type of enforcement, have dropped about 80% in terms of the number of ivory products that are being confiscated and being discovered in import, and also the demand or the price for ivory has dropped by 2/3 in China. And actually, if you went to China right before this went into full effect last year, you would have found a lot of ivory on sale, as you can imagine, trying to get that sold. And what does that mean for elephants on the ground? We don't fully know yet, but there is actually really encouraging evidence that, at least in Eastern Africa, that those populations, at least the number of animals who are dying to poaching is decreasing. We still have a really big problem in Central Africa and other places, but at least it seems like there's maybe an encouraging trend, and it could be related to this demand. It certainly seems logical that it would be. So hopefully that's improving. What we do know is not improving, however, unfortunately, is human-elephant conflict. And this is, of course, a different issue. Poaching is one form of conflict. Human-elephant conflict, what I mean by that is humans and elephants cohabiting in an area where former elephant territory is taken over by farming practices, whether it's for monoculture or for grazing, or human populations and villages themselves, and that is creating a situation where elephants and humans are coming into conflict. Elephants, of course, are fragmented into very small areas of habitat, and are in a lot of cases, quote unquote, overpopulated in that area as a result. And of course, there are finite resources in fragmented environments, and so there is an ecological impact there, and there's also, of course, a welfare impact there when elephants do not have a lot of resources that they need. And of course, that also encourages them to go into villages. Elephants kill hundreds of people every year, and all around the world. And it is a big problem. They destroy crops, they destroy villages. These people are desperately poor. And until we get these people to care about the elephants and their conservation, and of course, be able to put food on their own table, then we're going to have a very hard time ending that. Of course, there are some solutions, and I'm no expert on this. These are just things that I happen to be aware of. There are a lot of real solutions that we believe could be sustainable, could solve this problem, including sensible land and sustainable land management and use practices. Restoring elephant corridors has been hugely successful in some areas. And elephants will use corridors. They do use corridors. They're smart animals. They do not want to have conflict, and they will, they have these migratory routes are ancient, and they've been passing these down for culture after generation through their culture. So that's really important for them to be able to move around, and we've seen success with that. Humane methods of deterring elephants from crops and villages. There are a number of NGOs that are working out in Africa to help farmers specifically to deter elephants humanely. And then obviously habitat preservation and restoration and creating reserves where these animals can live. It's estimated, I think, that one elephant needs like 5 square kilometers or something alone just for the animals to survive and not have so much conflict. However, what we ultimately see, I've already talked a lot about the consequences that we see, particularly, I know this is really problematic with the Sumatran elephant, lots of poisoning. Hundreds of elephants every month are killed across the globe, of course, in just human-elephant conflict. The other issue is that I've talked about that these regions can become overpopulated because the area itself is fragmented. There are certain areas where they've been able to make an argument that elephants are actually such a detriment to the ecosystem or to other species who are there that they need to be culled or they need to be otherwise removed somehow. Culling used to be much more common back in the day. Of course, there's a lot of uproar when things like this happen now, and people are a little bit more engaged and aware. So the humane alternative that has come up and is much more common is that juvenile elephants end up being captured from these areas and sold into captivity, primarily for zoos in Asia and, yes, the US. So this is a little bit of history of that. This is just recent history, of course, and just what we know. In 2013, 11 Swaziland elephants were shipped to the US. So primarily we've been getting elephants from Swaziland. China's been getting elephants from Zimbabwe. So a number, obviously dozens, we're talking of elephants in the last 15 years or so. And then in 2016, these 2 African game reserves declared that despite the uproar, that these elephants would be shot if they could not be shipped away. And so, of course, the US zoo industry took initiative to go out there and save these animals, and bring them they're now in 3 different US zoos here. So that's very common. The other really big problem that we're all contributing to, unfortunately not all of us, but a lot of us in the US and Western civilization is contributing to, is the illegal captures of the and trade in live Asian elephants. It remains really prevalent practice and actually is believed to be increasing. This, of course, illegal, but there's no enforcement in a lot of these range countries, absolutely zero. There's actually pretty good laws. There's just no enforcement. And this is, of course, harder to track as well in forested areas where a lot of these animals live. Typically, it's the juveniles who are taken into captivity. They're broken and then used for tourism. And even the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species themselves have identified that the key driving factor for this trade is increased demand from tourism in a number of range countries. And that's, of course, primarily Westerners. And this is often well-intentioned. People don't realize when they go over to Asia that engaging, and often the messaging is very misleading as well. So it's intended to be misleading. Because, of course, these are quite lucrative activities. And, of course, originally in India, for example, elephants were legitimately used in temples for religious purposes. Now, oftentimes, you find elephants in temples to bless people when they come by and get good photo ops. Elephants are used in parades and a variety of other cultural means. Elephants are used for rides, bathing, and in pseudo-sanctuaries. There's not a single sanctuary in Asia that we actually believe has humane management practices for these animals. And unfortunately, there are a lot of sanctuaries out there who claim that they are. And so that's a really big problem because the public is deceived into thinking they're going to a place to support elephants who have been rescued and who are being treated humanely. And often we find that is just not the case behind closed doors. Elephants painting, this has become a really big thing and can sell for a good amount of money to unsuspecting tourists. And now voluntourism is a new thing. People paying to physically go and work with these animals and support facilities that are housing them in subpar conditions. Now a little bit of a transition to elephants in the US. There are a number of situations in which highly variable situations in which elephants are housed. There are only 2 sanctuaries. One is in Tennessee and the other is in Northern California. And these are the only places in America where these elephants are given acres on which to roam, are managed in a humane manner as much as possible. In accredited zoos, you have a couple of leading zoos who are really taking an active role in trying to approximate that, at least for their elephants, trying to expand their enclosures, provide elephants with better socialization opportunities, and some of that is happening. By and large, we'll talk in a minute, that it's still, unfortunately, we're having a very hard time providing for elephant health and welfare in a captive setting, no matter where it is. Roadside zoos are non-accredited facilities. When I say accredited, I'm really referring to the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which I'll refer to as the AZA from now on. AZA zoos, there's only about 250 of them in the country, and they're your big city zoos. Roadside zoos, there are thousands of these, on the other hand, in the country, and far less stringent requirements for animal health and welfare and care. Traveling exhibitors, circuses and fairs. A lot of you probably heard the news about Ringling shutting down. Unfortunately, Delci's going to talk a lot more about that, but unfortunately that was not the end of circuses as we know it, although we believe it's the beginning of the end. Elephant rides, elephants and weddings. So this is at a roadside zoo, actually. This is a traveling elephant, but she is housed alone. She's used daily to give rides to patrons at the zoo. Elephants are commonly still actually used in weddings and brought to campuses and all sorts of other types of events that are very questionable and certainly not humane. Why is this not humane? I already spoke to you about the complex social and emotional needs of these elephants. They have a lot of behavioral challenges associated with that. Of course, they have unique needs we've already talked about. Some of those consequences result in really severe stereotypic behaviors. Stereotypy is a term that's really important when you're talking about captive wildlife. It relates to the degree to which that animal is deprived from engaging in natural behaviors that animal's biologically driven to engage in. And so when they are inhibited from that, they will engage in abnormal, repetitive, mindless behaviors, and those are stereotypies. We see a high instance of stereotypy in these animals related to deprivation, aggression, foot and nail disease. I already told you these animals are between 6,000 and 15,000 pounds. You can imagine what carrying that amount of weight around is like in general, let alone when you're housed on concrete substrates. Not to mention the implications for elephants being able to communicate, which we just, of course, learned about. But yes, many captive elephants are housed chronically on concrete. It results in chronic nail cracks, chronic nail and foot infections, and arthritis. That is actually the leading killer of elephants in captivity, is foot disease and arthritis. Second to that, close second, is infectious disease. Of course, infectious disease is problematic when you have a lot of animals crowded together, especially when they're stressed, and that, of course, tends to happen a bit more in traveling exhibit type situations. But across the board with elephants in captivity, we see that. We also see a number of other issues, including reproductive failure and also premature death. And these guys, they definitely do not live. There's no figure that anyone can point to say that they live as long or approximate in any way the natural lifespans of elephants in the wild, which of course indicates that there's probably something wrong that we're doing. I'm going to let Delcy talk about bullhooks. I'm going to skip that. But I did want to touch on the industry standard. These AZA facilities, they excellent veterinary care in a lot of cases. Really kind of the facilities that are considered to be doing the best for these animals, and we still are seeing all of these problems. In these situations, this bullhook, this is a domination tool. Delcy's going to talk about it. Not expressly prohibited, so still sometimes occurring in these facilities. There's not, in AZA facilities, there just are not that many elephants. Unfortunately, because they're having reproductive failure, we're having a hard time sustaining the population here in captivity, and that means that there aren't that many elephants in each facility, and so you only required to have 2 males or 3 females. And of course, they don't have to be related to each other, which relates to the way African Elephant Society is, in particular, Asians as well. Lots of illness and stereotypy. Breeding is frequently, like I said, unsuccessful, even though we have spent many, many years and lots of money trying to perfect artificial insemination for elephants and understand the way their systems work. We still have lots of reproductive failure, and then when we do have a successful reproduction, there is a really high infant mortality. So ultimately, these animals are not, my point is they are never, regardless of this, they would never be contributing to they never go back to the wild, the actual sustainability of their populations in the wild. And it's questionable whether or not they will actually be sustainable in captivity, depending upon how many Swaziland elephants they manage to keep getting. And I will pass it off to Delcy now, sorry.
All right, thank you, Heather. Hi, everybody. So in terms of elephants held captive in the US, there are a little over 400, and they're almost evenly divided between Asian and Africans. And of those, about 50 are held by circuses, and there's also another almost 3 dozen currently confined at Ringwing's compound in Florida. On the road, at any given time, there will be about a dozen elephants, so they're moving back and forth between headquarters and being put out on the road. And I'm going to focus my discussion on those elephants used for circuses for a couple of reasons. One, because they suffer the very worst welfare conditions, but also because we're seeing the most progress in this area right now. So I want to talk about some of those recent legal developments. Also, it's important to note that there are direct ties between elephants and circuses and some of the other issues that Heather mentioned, including imports from the wild. Most of the elephants currently being used in circuses were imported from the wild. And the zoo issues. There has been a long-standing trade back and forth between circuses and zoos in elephants. So because Circuses with wild animals are a huge welfare issue. They've been a prime target of PETA's for all of the years, almost 40 years that PETA has been around, and a prime target of the animal rights movement generally. There are, of course, demonstrations have been a part of that, but there's also legal efforts on behalf of elephants. And one of the very first of those involved a company called the Hawthorne Corporation, which was notorious for its treatment of elephants that it supplied to circuses. One of its elephants famously rampaged, killed her trainer, injured numerous other people, ran wild through the streets, and was shot dozens of times before she finally collapsed and died. There was rampant tuberculosis at the Hawthorne Corporation. 2 elephants died of the disease in the same week. They forced an elephant to stand in undiluted formaldehyde, resulting in chemical burns. That was their way of treating her foot problems. So just really, really awful stuff. And in the early 2000s, the USDA, after receiving evidence from PETA and investigating this matter, executed its first ever seizure of an elephant. It was the elephant Delhi who had her feet soaked in undiluted formaldehyde. The USDA then required that Hawthorne remove all of the elephants in its possession. And what Hawthorne did was decided it wanted to send them all to another notorious circus company, Carson and Barnes Circus. And I'm sparing you footage, but the head trainer of Carson and Barnes, who is still the head trainer there, has been caught on video electric shocking elephants, viciously beating them, swearing at them, all of this until they cry out loud. They've also been cited over and over for violations of the Animal Welfare Act. So it was not a good place for these elephants to go. It was not a good resolution of the USDA's legal proceedings. So PETA sued to try and prevent this transfer from happening, and that was one of my very first elephant cases when I was a baby lawyer. And ultimately we lost that case on standing, but it was able to sort of muck up the process, shed some light on things, slow things down a little bit so that campaign efforts could continue. And as a result, almost all of those elephants were sent to the 2 accredited sanctuaries that Heather mentioned. Hawthorne did, unfortunately, continue to supply tigers to the circus industry, but I am very happy to report that last year they finally shuttered and are no longer supplying any animals to the trade. So Ringling Brothers. We could not talk about circus elephants without talking about Ringling Brothers, of course. As I'm sure you know, last year there was a huge victory when Ringling Brothers shuttered after 146 years of exploiting elephants and other wild animals. And this came after decades of advocacy, including protests in every city, every year, an Endangered Species Act lawsuit that spanned more than a decade, yet the court never reached the merits, but very damning and compelling evidence came out as a result of that. There was also a whistleblower, a trainer from Ringling, who came forward and disclosed photographs that he had of their process of separating baby elephants from their mothers, breaking their spirits, and then training them to perform. So Heather mentioned bull hooks a number of times, and this here is the bull hook. This is the bull hook here. It's a fireplace poker-like weapon that is used to keep elephants in check. If there is an elephant in a circus, there is a bull hook nearby. It may be hidden up someone's sleeve. It may have electric tape wrapped up just to the point because the public is starting to know to look for it, but it is there somewhere. And elephants go through this brutal training process in which they know that if they don't do exactly what they're told, they are going to be beaten with the bull hook. As a result, they often don't need to use the bull hook in public. Merely seeing it reminds the elephant of what will happen to her if she does not obey. If she doesn't obey, she'll go through what's called a tune-up afterwards. They will chain her by 4 legs, proceed to beat her for an hour or more to remind her that she better stay in check next time. So these photographs came out notably when Ringling's head trainer was asked by the Washington Post about these photographs. He said these are, quote, classic pictures of professional elephant training. In other words, this is how it's done everywhere. There's no other way to break the spirit of a multi-ton, highly social animal. There was also a PETA undercover investigation that found handlers in city after city beating elephants right before they went on stage, as, again, a reminder that they need to behave. A PETA complaint resulted in the USDA assessing the largest fine ever under the Animal Welfare Act against an exhibitor, against Ringling Brothers, and so on and so on. So Ringling did shutter. It was a huge victory. But like I said, there are still about a dozen elephants on the road at any given time in this country, and they too are forced to perform under the constant threat of punishment. They're kept in chains, unable to move more than a step or two in any direction, typically for all but the few minutes that they're on stage on a show. So how is it that we have this situation in America? Elephants, whether they're Asian or African, are protected by the Endangered Species Act. It's illegal to harm and harass them. They're also protected by the Federal Animal Welfare Act, whose stated purpose is to ensure the humane care and treatment of animals used for exhibition. Yet here we are. And it's mostly a question of lax enforcement. The Fish and Wildlife Service, which is responsible for enforcing the Endangered Species Act, has typically shown very little interest in captive wildlife issues. It did remove 2 elephants from a very bad exhibitor who had disguised a sale of elephants as a lease, so it has done things from time to time. But for the most part, it's shown little interest, and that's only been exacerbated in the current administration. The USDA, meanwhile, which enforces the Animal Welfare Act, or is supposed to, has been notoriously lax in its implementation of that law. The USDA's own Office of Inspector General has issued audit after audit after audit condemning enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act as, quote, ineffective. The agency very rarely takes enforcement action. When it does take so-called enforcement action, in the vast majority of cases, that's the form of a warning that carries no repercussions. And even when fines are levied, they are pennies on the dollar compared to the statutorily available fines. They're reduced so greatly that in the Inspector General's word, they're treated as a, quote, cost of doing business. What's more, even in the face of chronic violations, year after year, the USDA will renew the license that's needed to continue exhibiting animals. So in the past, groups like PETA and others were at least able to step in, monitor the situation, and act for these animals based on information that the USDA gathered but failed to act on. We were able to get inspection reports from the USDA's website. These were posted for many years. Unfortunately, all of that changed last year when the USDA abruptly removed tens of thousands of records from its website. And even in response to FOIA requests now, it's refusing to hand over most substantive information, contending that it should be protected because it might, quote, embarrass the exhibitors. And these appalling failures, I think, are best epitomized by the case of an elephant named Nosy. This is Nosy here. Nosy was kidnapped from Zimbabwe as a baby, along with dozens of other baby elephants. Their families were slaughtered in front of them in a government-sponsored cull, and then they were gathered up, shipped to America, and a U.S. businessman sold them off to various circuses and zoos. Nosy ended up with the Liebel family circus, where she endured many years of neglect and many years without the company of a single other elephant, despite the fact that, as Heather told you about, female elephants are extremely social. She was also handled abusively. A worker for the circus blew the whistle at one point. He recounted frequent use of electric prods on Nosy and detailed one incident in which Nosy's trainer, quote, used the bullhook handle, turned off the lights in the performance ring, and beat the elephant. He at the time directed others to take part in that by using other objects, such as a sledgehammer and shovel handles. At the time, the elephant was staked down by all 4 legs. Nosy was hauled around the country, forced to give rides and perform tricks under the constant threat of the bullhook. She had to give these rides even though she suffered painful, crippling arthritis. She spent years chained on hard surfaces when she should have been walking many miles on soft substrates. I want to just show you a video of Nosy's situation. Nope, not that one.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture is responsible for making sure that animals used for entertainment are kept safe from harm, including this elephant named Nosy. But when USDA officials saw Nosy barely able to bend her left hind leg, they looked the other way. And when USDA officials saw her legs buckled and that she nearly fell with 4 children on her back, they thought everything was fine. When we sent USDA officials more footage showing that Nosy was hobbling around because of the chronic pain behind her legs, they did nothing to help her. And when they saw that moments later, Nosy was forced to tow a loaded van and trailer out of the mud, USDA officials did nothing to stop it. saw Nosey's handler threaten her with a sharp bullhook. They didn't do anything about it. And when a veterinarian who saw Nosey told USDA officials that Nosey demonstrates needless suffering and pain with each step while forced to provide rides to the public, they just didn't care. It's time for the USDA to start caring about Nosey.
Okay. So, that's Nosey's situation. The USDA did do something. It cited the Liebels for almost 100 violations of the Animal Welfare Act over the years, including chaining her so tightly by 2 legs that she could barely move, allowing manure to accumulate around her feet, potentially exposing her to fatal infection, repeatedly denying her adequate veterinary care, and much more. And in 2012, we had a glimmer of hope when the USDA filed a case against the Liebels alleging 33 violations of the Animal Welfare Act. As a result, they faced at least $330,000 in potential penalties and potentially losing their license to continue exhibiting Nosey. Unfortunately, as is all too typical, the following year, the USDA settled the case for $7,500. What's more, we recently learned through a Freedom of Information Act request that the Liebels never even bothered to pay that $7,500. But year after year, the USDA has continued renewing their license. They still have a license to this day. PETA did everything we could for Nosey. I even hired one of my former law students to work on behalf of Nosey. Other groups and many compassionate and passionate individuals mobilized around Nosey. And among other things, folks went to every single venue that hosted Nosey, often went to the governments in the places where she was being brought, where local laws prohibited having elephants. And we were successful a lot of times. We got places to agree not to host the Liebels. But this was necessarily piecemeal. Without the USDA taking action, without some federal bigger picture action, they just went on to the next town. So that was the situation until last November. In early last November, the Liebels were found parked in Moulton, Alabama, having work done on their truck. Local authorities started getting complaints in about a confined elephant who was neglected and just being held in a parking lot. The county animal control officer, because they only have one, went out and found Nosey chained, unable to move, standing in her own waste, without adequate food, water, or shelter. She was also, some of the time, observed being housed in a tiny trailer where she would sway back and forth. This is a photo, or a video rather, of Nosey inside the trailer, and the trailer itself would sway as a result. And as Heather told you, that's just a clear sign of poor welfare. Ultimately, authorities, that's the inside of the trailer that she was being held in. It's filthy. You can't see quite the extent of the filth in that photo, but that was where she spent much of her time, unable to turn around, unable to take a step. Authorities arrested the Liebels on cruelty charges, but even before that, they seized Nosey. They seized Nosey, and she was transported to the elephant sanctuary. At the time she was seized, she appeared to have a nearly empty gastrointestinal tract, to be dehydrated. She had a long-standing, untreated condition of skin overgrowth, scaly, dry, and cracked skin. It's called hyperkeratosis. It was untreated. As a result of that untreated skin condition, she had a bacterial skin infection. She also had a urinary tract infection. She had intestinal parasites. She had arthritis, as you saw in the footage, but that was confirmed by x-rays, very bad arthritis. She had muscle atrophy. She was in really bad shape as a result of neglect. And in January, the trial court judge held a hearing, a full-day trial, and ruled that Nosey could stay at the sanctuary permanently. And this is Nosey at the sanctuary. You can see, this is an early days picture. You can see her skin condition here. It's something that's going to take a long time to completely heal, if it ever can completely heal, because of how long-standing the neglect was. But she is doing amazing at the sanctuary. She's thriving. She's getting the care she needs finally. And she can just be an elephant. She has a vast habitat to roam. She can knock trees down whenever she wants. She can wallow in mud. She can dust bathe. She can be an elephant. The Liebels are appealing. Nosey's case is ongoing and maybe for many years to come. But meanwhile, Nosey is in sanctuary. It's another photo of her in her habitat. But there are numerous other elephants who are suffering very similar fates. Dozens of countries across the world have banned traveling wild animal acts, but the United States is woefully behind. It's only a matter of time before we catch up with the rest of the world, but I think we owe it to those animals to make that day come as quickly as possible. So there are a number of things being done to expedite that day, and there are a number of things that you all can do in this room if you want. At the federal level, PETA is leading the charge on aggressively challenging the USDA's assault on transparency. We have 4 FOIA lawsuits pending against the USDA to restore access to that information. We also have a 5th lawsuit challenging their policy of automatically renewing licenses in the face of ongoing violations. But some of the most important developments that are happening for elephants and other wild animals in traveling acts right now are happening at the local and state level. Dozens of jurisdictions have banned bullhooks or banned elephants or banned all traveling wild animal acts. California and Rhode Island at the state level have banned bullhooks. Most recently, Illinois and New York banned traveling elephant acts. Notably, PACE undergrad students spearheaded that effort in New York through a clinic at the university. I think that's a great role model. Some of you VLS students might want to think about that. I was happy to see signs in Woodstock over the weekend for Circus Smirkus, which is animal-free, but Garden Brothers, another notorious elephant abuser, does continue to frequent Vermont. So you can do something here in your backyard. And you don't need to be a lawyer or a law student to do that. You need to be a constituent who's willing to put in some legwork. And you can also just educate people. People don't want to support this abuse. They mostly just don't know what is going on. So, and there so we can do some questions.
Thank you for your presentations. Just wondering if PETA has any way of targeting the individuals at the USDA in terms of calling them out in a public way that would put pressure on the USDA.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to sue. You can sue agencies, they get a huge amount of deference. In terms of trying to hold them publicly accountable, absolutely, we have tried to do that. We've printed full-page ads calling out their failings. Unfortunately, they often don't seem to care. I mean, we've had tens of thousands of members contact them. What we've found to be more effective is when people go to their individual members of Congress and they can put some pressure on the USDA. The USDA has to answer questions from Congress, and when they get that pressure, that's one of the most effective things that can happen.
Hi, is this on?
Yeah.
So I'm interested in your earlier point that elephants, that the poachers are very poor, don't have income alternatives possibly, and that the elephants live in these vast ecosystems that are valuable for palm production. In addition to changing the demand side, ivory and elephants in circuses, what kind of potentials do you see in changing the supply side? Are there any good examples of providing employment alternatives to people on the ground, and also potential links between the animal welfare side of elephant and other endangered species poaching with sustainable agriculture, sustainable palm production, and how do we hold that side of it accountable? Because are there potentials like labeling, false advertising litigation, and what do you see as potential strategies in the next 5 years?
Big question. Lots of components. Related to, yes, I think both sides, there's a lot of improvement that can be had in terms of demand, both demand and supply. In the palm oil issue specifically, what we can do, it is very hard because there's no traceability of that product right now, absolutely no traceability. So it's very hard. Even the sustainable palm oil programs aren't really, the system isn't such that everything you're getting in that package is sustainable palm oil, right? So we need to get to a stage where there's a demand for transparency within the supply chain, and that does come with, overall, with enhanced just global awareness about what's going on. And I always tell people, first of all, it's impossible to boycott palm oil, almost impossible, completely, to eradicate it from your life. It's not just snack food, it's in cosmetics, it's in soaps, it's in so much, and it's often mislabeled. So when you think you're not consuming palm oil, just check the hundreds of other names that they have a tendency to put on the labels. So it's hard to do that, but what we can do, there are great NGOs here locally in the US. Rainforest Action Network is really the place to go. They have great resources on their website as to who the major traders and also the major the snack food companies that are the biggest problem that we need to be putting the most pressure on. So from a demand standpoint, we need to raise awareness and we need to get people to use their voices to demand that this happen. And you can do that through Rainforest Action Network and other groups that are doing that. On the ground, I'm far less of an expert. I do know that there are other NGOs out there who have microloan programs that they're working on in some of these areas to help sort of offset the detriment that getting out of this business is going to do economically to people. There are definitely cases where I do believe palm oil can be grown sustainably. Absolutely, I do. But there's enforcement on the ground. So that's why, yes, agricultural practices are an important part of that, but largely enforcement in the NGOs that are on the ground are largely working in a law enforcement capacity locally, of course, to try to get the ecosystem that I spoke to you about that has the last of the world's great massive endangered megafauna. That ecosystem is protected under Indonesian national law. The protection's already in place, but that is how corrupt the system is there politically. It is just not enforced, but because that law exists, it creates enforcement opportunities. And so there are people on the ground who are doing that, and they're succeeding, like I said, and they're restoring forest. I mean, but the bottom line, I think, across the board is that we need to be using land more in a more efficient manner. Land planning needs to be better. Management needs to be better. And we can do that by taking into account animals and people and both of their needs. And I think that we can achieve sustainable palm oil if we start speaking up, if we start playing a role. I think it is possible. It's going to take a lot. Sorry, that was a long one.
I think we need to end, unfortunately, but hopefully Heather and Delcianna might stay for a couple minutes if people want to come up and have questions.
We actually have to teach right now, but our email addresses are on the slide, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. And we're around on campus, and we have an event this evening that will be at if you want to come talk to us there.
Thank you so much.